David Cruz is 70 years old, living in Pasco County near Port Richey, Florida, and like many people who reach retirement age, he believed he'd already fought his hardest financial battles. According to Cruz, his income is limited to Social Security, and the safety net he had built over a lifetime of work wasn't a luxury, it was survival. Then, earlier this year, a single online connection, framed as companionship, turned into a financial collapse. Cruz says he lost $47,000 in what authorities describe as an online romance scam. Money he believed was helping someone he cared about until he realized it was part of a coordinated fraud. According to Cruz, the loss was so severe that he felt he was going to lose everything he had worked for, and the emotional impact left him confronting depression and a sharp sense of shame that often follows victims long after the money is gone. According to Cruz, the story did not begin with reckless spending or a risky investment. It began with loneliness, hope, and the ordinary desire to talk to someone who seemed kind. He says he was searching for companionship online when he received a Facebook friend request from a woman identifying herself as Bonnie Fleck. Cruz says Bonnie presented herself as an interior decorator from Indianapolis, Indiana, and their conversations quickly took on the tone of a relationship. Consistent messaging, personal talk, and frequent contact that made the connection feel real. Over time, Cruz says the chats evolved into phone calls and what appeared to be video calls as well, creating the impression that he wasn't simply chatting with a profile, but interacting with a real person. Investigators later concluded those video chats, according to reporting on the case, were AI-generated, adding a modern, unsettling layer to a classic confidence scheme. Cruz says he believed he had found someone who understood him. He describes the relationship as emotionally convincing, and that is often the turning point in romance scams. The moment a victim stops evaluating the situation like a stranger on the internet and starts responding like a partner. According to Cruz, Bonnie soon introduced a complication that required help. He says she claimed she had been offered work in Australia but needed money for paperwork to secure the opportunity. The request, as Cruz recounts it, was framed as temporary and practical, an obstacle a supportive partner would help solve. According to Cruz, he wanted to do the right thing. He believed her story, believed the urgency, and believed the relationship was genuine. Cruz says the first payment was $5,000. According to Cruz, it didn't come from spare cash because he didn't have spare cash. He says he dipped into an emergency home equity loan, money that was meant to protect him, not to be gambled away. The decision, as he describes it, wasn't made in a single reckless moment, but in the steady pressure of a relationship that had been carefully built. Scammers, authorities warn, often begin with an amount that is large enough to matter, but small enough to rationalize. And once that first transfer happens, the dynamic changes. According to Cruz, after that initial payment, more requests followed. Each time, he says, there was another reason, another deadline, another complication, another promise that the situation would be resolved soon. Over time, Cruz says the transfers escalated. He reports that he ultimately wired a total of $47,000, including payments that moved through Bitcoin. That detail is significant because cryptocurrency transfers can create a sense of distance from the transaction, less like handing over cash, more like following instructions in a digital process. According to Cruz, he followed those instructions because he believed he was helping someone he trusted, and because the relationship made the requests feel personal rather than transactional. The more he sent, the more invested he became, not only financially, but emotionally. In many scams, victims become trapped between doubt and hope, and the scammer exploits that tension. Cruz says he kept going, believing the next payment would be the last, believing the crisis would end, believing the relationship would finally move forward into something stable and real. Cruz's account also reflects a reality investigators often emphasize. These schemes are not only about money, but control. A romance scammer's leverage is emotional. According to Cruz, he was not simply convinced by a single message. He was drawn into an ongoing connection, one where affection, attention, and urgency combined into a persuasive force. The scam, as described in reporting, relied on impersonation and on credibility cues designed to override suspicion. In this case, Cruz says the scammer presented herself as a professional, an interior decorator, and anchored her identity to a plausible U.S. city, Indianapolis. Then, according to the report, the fraud deepened with technology. Video interactions that appeared real but were later determined to be AI-generated. If Cruz believed he had seen her face and heard her speak, it becomes easier to understand how his defenses could have lowered. A human brain is wired to trust what feels like direct contact, and scams increasingly exploit that instinct. Eventually, Cruz says the requests became more aggressive. According to Cruz, the money demands escalated to a point where the situation no longer felt like a temporary setback. He says he began to feel something was wrong, and when that feeling became impossible to ignore, he reported what was happening to the Pasco County Sheriff's Office. That moment, the shift from private doubt to official reporting, is often the breaking point for victims. It is also the moment the fantasy collapses. According to investigators, the account Cruz had been interacting with was not linked to Indiana. Detectives traced the profile to Nigeria, the identity he had trusted, the story of a decorator heading to Australia, the emotional bond he believed was forming. Authorities concluded it was part of an overseas fraud operation. For Cruz, the consequences weren't limited to the bank balance. According to his own words, the fear was existential. At 70 years old, Cruz said, with only Social Security income, he felt he was going to lose everything he had worked for. He also described the emotional damage in blunt, painful terms: depression and the loss of self-worth that comes from not realizing sooner that the relationship was a lie. That reaction is common among fraud victims, who often blame themselves even when the crime was carefully engineered to exploit normal human needs. According to Cruz, the shame and regret were as heavy as the financial loss, and yet he chose to speak publicly, not to relive humiliation, but to prevent someone else from repeating the same steps. The warning signs in this case become clearer in hindsight, but they are not always obvious in real time, especially when the scam is designed to feel like love, not like theft. Authorities warn that romance scams often begin with a rapid escalation of intimacy, consistent messaging that builds emotional dependency, and stories that create urgency and isolate the victim from outside advice. In Cruz's case, the claim of overseas work and sudden paperwork costs fit a familiar pattern: a distant opportunity, a temporary crisis, and a request for financial help that tests loyalty. Another significant red flag, according to law enforcement guidance on these scams, is the method of payment. Cruz says he sent money through wire transfers and Bitcoin, forms of payment frequently used by scammers because they are difficult to trace and reverse once completed. Even the presence of video chats, which might normally reassure a cautious person, became a risk factor here because investigators later concluded those visuals were AI-generated. The technology that seems to prove identity can now be used to manufacture it. Despite these indicators, victims often remain in the scam because each step is framed as proof of devotion, and each doubt is countered with reassurance. According to Cruz, he ultimately reached a point where his gut told him something wasn't right. His advice now reflects the hard lesson behind that realization. He says people should not go only with the heart because the heart can be manipulated. That statement isn't a slogan. It's a summary of how romance scams operate, using emotion as a tool to bypass logic. As for the current status, Cruz reported the scam to the Pasco County Sheriff's Office, and investigators determined the account was connected to Nigeria rather than Indiana. According to the reporting, the story, as presented, does not confirm whether the funds have been recovered or whether any suspects have been arrested or charged. What is clear is that Cruz is living with the financial impact of the loss, and according to his statements, the emotional fallout remains significant. His decision to speak publicly appears rooted in prevention, using his experience as a warning, not as entertainment, and not as an attempt to claim certainty about outcomes that remain unknown. Cases like Cruz's are part of a broader and growing fraud landscape. Law enforcement agencies warn that romance scams are increasing, with older adults often targeted because scammers look for people who may be lonely, trusting, or living on fixed incomes. In many cases, victims lose life savings, and once the money is moved, especially through cryptocurrency, recovery can be extremely difficult. Authorities describe this as a high-impact crime because it combines financial theft with emotional exploitation, leaving victims not only struggling to pay bills, but questioning their judgment and their worth. Cruz's experience, as reported, shows how quickly a seemingly ordinary online connection can turn into a pipeline for extracting money, one payment at a time. Officials recommend practical steps to reduce the risk. Authorities advise caution with online relationships, noting that scammers often use fake profiles and stolen images. They recommend avoiding sending money to someone who has not been met in person, especially through wire transfers or cryptocurrency. They also suggest verifying identities, including using reverse image searches to see whether profile photos appear elsewhere online. Another safeguard is social. Talking things through with a trusted friend or family member before sending money, because an outside perspective can spot inconsistencies that feel invisible inside an emotionally charged relationship. And when fraud is suspected, victims can report it to federal agencies such as the Federal Trade Commission and the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center, creating a record that may help investigators identify patterns and networks. David Cruz says he is sharing his story because he hopes someone else will stop sooner than he did. According to Cruz, the damage was not just $47,000, but the fear of losing the life he built and the emotional wreckage that followed. His warning is simple and hard-earned. When something feels wrong, that feeling matters. And in an era where scammers can impersonate not only identities but even faces on a screen, his story underscores a difficult truth. Trust online must be earned with verification, not emotion, because the cost of misplaced trust can be everything.